Well, today's topic was that we are going to instead come up with 3 job concepts for each of us, and just present them in an idea of something we'd like to see in the game.
So as you can see, we don't have a webcam on right now. That's because I kind of wanted to do this presentation in I wanted to present my own job with like this little scuffed presentation. So I do apologize in advance because I've never done this kind of a thing live before. Like, you know, when I edit my videos, I have all the time in the world, but this is a different thing, right? So we'll begin with the job that I had planned for this. So first of all, the first thing we must consider when adding a new job, right, is the weapon type, right? That's very important. So this is does anyone recognize this weapon? I heard it's not as clumsy or random as a blaster, but it's an elegant weapon for a more civilized age. So I bet most of you will recognize this, right? Obviously, that's the lightsaber from Star Wars. And I know what some of you guys will say when you see this. A lightsaber would be so out of place in 14. They would never add such a weapon. But personally, I feel the opposite, because I think adding such a big Star Wars reference would be precisely what I expect from the developers. And this is why. Because this game is pretty much full of Star Wars references, and the Final Fantasy devs in general have always been huge Star Wars fans. And, you know, obviously 14 is no exception to that. So I think a lightsaber wouldn't even be that out of place. And this may sound a bit cocky, but I'm honestly confident that within the next, let's say, next 5 years or so, we'll probably get some variation of the lightsaber in 14. Because the lightsaber is a much higher tech than what we have available to us in 14, we can't of course export it over as is. So I've kind of limited it a bit to fit it into the scope of 14 setting. So the first thing here, as you can see, is that I would actually make use of Corvus, which is a place we have not visited yet. But those of you who are really observant, or the eagle-eyed among you, may remember that this is an imperial province. And it's pretty much famous, I guess, for the fact that a certain cat boy comes from that place. But so this weapon, the saber itself, would be Magitech, and Ceruleum allows the ignition of the blade. But because the technology isn't that advanced, right? The Ceruleum light processing on the blade to ignite it, it's not that efficient. It's not like Star Wars where you can just, just ignite the blade and it's on forever. That's why you need to use some ether for it to still be effective. And this is kind of a deliberate design flaw made by the Corvosi, because this makes it so that the Garleans wouldn't be able to use this weapon. So compared to a regular sword, it's obviously a lot lighter, though it's still not a feather, like it still weighs a bit. But, since the blade itself isn't made of metal, it is a little bit lighter. Additionally, it's obviously easier to conceal, right? Because you only need the hilt. The downsides are that, first of all, they're pretty hard to come by. They're pretty rare. And also, well, because you need someone who's an expert with ceruleum to even make this kind of a thing, right? Which especially after a certain event in Endwalker, you may struggle to find such people. The other downside to this sword, or this saber rather, is that because of the fact that it is lighter, technically, if you trained with a sword for like 10 years and you picked up this weapon, it will take you quite some time to become proficient with it, right? So I think ultimately, this wouldn't be like a groundbreaking weapon at all. Most people would still say, why bother with this fancy shit, just use a sword. But it would still be a cool weapon for the warrior fight, for sure. So that's the weapon. But obviously there is more to a job than just the weapon. So what about the job itself? So I've named it Swordmaster, or Swordmaster if you are American. It's a melee DPS. Now, I want to already note on this. I know what some people will say. well, we just got Reaper. They're not gonna add another melee DPS, right? But my thought process on thinking about coming job is that I didn't think of what would come in the next expansion necessarily. I thought of like if such a job was ever added. So because I main ninja, right? So I always gravitate towards melees myself. It's been my favorite role. So, naturally when I think of a job, I think of a melee DPS. So this would be, the next melee DPS most likely won't come until like 9.0 or 10.0 or something. So this would be super far off. But, nonetheless, I would want it to be a melee. So the blade itself is further empowered by elemental magicite that is obtained from Eureka. In this way, as you just saw with Corvos, I kind of want to make use of different areas to make use of this job rather than just, the three main city-states or whatever. I want to kind of spice it up a bit. And before someone asks, no, you don't need to complete Eureka to unlock this job. But in essence, this job could be summarized as taking inspiration from Star Wars because of the weapon, Mystic Knight because of the mechanic I'm about to describe, and HEMA, which for those who don't know, that's historical European martial arts. And, when we think of sword fighting, right, we think it's just two blokes who kind of just swing their blades kind of randomly, until someone gets the killing stroke. But in reality, fighting with swords in medieval times, it used to be so much more involved, right? There were dozens upon dozens of techniques and ways to kind of outplay your opponent. So this job really appeals to people who like that kind of a style, right? Like a shit ton of different techniques used in sword fighting, because I don't think there's such a job in FF14 right now. Like the closest would be Red Mage. But even Red Mage is does 3 moves basically, and even they may not be necessarily the best representation. So the way we combine the Mystic Knight and HEMA element is we have 6 elemental forms, and these are basically different styles of fighting that have an element attached to them. So we have all the 6 main elements in play here. For those who really know their Star Wars lore, my idea here pretty much comes directly from Star Wars. But obviously, if this theoretically was added to the game, obviously these forms would be different. But I'm just using this. Likewise for the weapon itself, obviously it wouldn't be called a lightsaber. They would name it something different, but for the sake of brevity, I'm just gonna refer to it as such. So we have 6 forms here. We have form 1, Shicho, which is the water form, and this is basically the oldest known form, which is often used against multiple opponents, and it's simplistic. By the way, these forms in setting, these are actual techniques used by the Corvosi swordsmen from ancient times, because for those of you who read one of the side stories in Stormblood, you may remember that Xenos was trained by a Corvosi swordsman, and he was kind of talking about, these long-known techniques that get passed down that only the Corvosi know. So this would also tap into that lore element. Then we have Form 2, which is Makashi, the wind element. This is an elegant, graceful form, perfect for duelists. This involves quick, precise strikes. In Star Wars, this was the form used by Count Dooku, so you can imagine that kind of form. Then we have Form 3, which is Soresu. This is a defensive style, and it pretty much entirely focuses on defense, and this is used to take their time analyzing opponents and not to succumb to fatigue themselves. So for such a form, the most natural element is ice, which is the most passive of all the elements. And this was used by Obi-Wan Kenobi as an example. Form 4, Ataru. This is acrobatic and aggressive, but very demanding. This was used by, if you guys remember episode 2 and 3, where Yoda He's basically just jumping all over the place. This is basically that form. Just picture that, right? Like just very, very quick and very aggressive. But you can't sustain it for long. Form 5, Shien. This is like a combination of the last two forms, because Form 3 and Form 4 are kind of opposites of each other. This is kind of a blend between them. So here you quickly transition from defensive stances to doing all-out attacks. And this one also utilizes a reverse blade grip. This was used by Anakin, if I recall. And then we have Form 6, Niemann, and this is basically the Tesco of the forms. It balances all the qualities of the other forms, and it has no real strengths. So this like pretty much just an all-around, and Earth is pretty much perfect for that. So those are all the forms. Now, how does the job utilize them, however? So there are many things in 14's lore that do not get utilized. As an example, did you know that each element have a submissive relation to each other? This basically explains Eureka, but a bit more in depth. So Earth grounds lightning, lightning boils water, water erodes Earth, and then fire is extinguished by wind, ice is melted by fire, and wind is obstructed by ice. So these are basically the three conquests and submissions. And as I said, this is not really prevalent except, I guess, Eureka, but that's like a separate system. So I would want to make this kind of a thing a bit more apparent in the lore, because, let's say you fight Ifrit, right? And you blast him with ice spells. It doesn't really do anything. So the question becomes, right, like how do we implement Mystic Knight and kind of be a bit faithful to the class? So this is kind of making use of that. So how it works in practice is that you start off with any element, and then your next two elements are locked in. And then you start with another element of the remaining group of your choosing, and the next two are locked in once again. So this may seem a little confusing based on just this text, so let me show you with an image what I mean. So say you start off with ice, you then have to use fire and then wind. Then you have a choice between starting with earth, lightning, or water, and then the other two are locked in. So the logic here is in setting, right? Is that you're coding the enemy's ether with the element you're attacking with, which in turn makes them more vulnerable to the element that conquers it. So you're essentially creating a weakness on the enemy that you can then abuse. In a sense, if you want a real-world equivalent, right? Think of it as pouring gasoline on someone, and then you set them on fire. That's a basic gameplay loop on this job. And in practice, you wouldn't actually need to memorize any of this. If you guys played Dancer, it's kind of like that, where the thing lights up, and there's no real memorization. So don't worry, it's not like you have to actually memorize all of this shit, because that's not where I want the difficulty to come from. Rather, I want the difficulty to be in the fact that with this system, you kind of have to think a bit ahead, essentially, right? You have to think let's say 20 seconds ahead on what you want to do. It's similar to Summoner, with how you have a choice in what order to complete your rotation, but with a few extra rules, essentially. Like with Summoner, there will be differences between the forms, but we can make it a lot more interesting because it's a melee DPS, right? So some forms might have more range attacks than others. Some may have no range attacks at all. Some may have real positionals, some flank positionals, some have mixed, some have no positionals. As an example from when I enlisted the forms, the ice form would last the longest, while the fire one is very short to kind of reflect them. The water form would have all attacks deal AoE damage innately, making it ideal for 2-target scenarios in a raid, and things of that nature. So the whole rotation would take about 2 minutes, and probably some reward for doing so, right? You get some PogChamp attack or some shit. And on top of it, you of course have things like off globals and maybe an additional gauge, but here I just wanted to tell you the core mechanic. So The point of this is to replicate Mystic Knight's ability to take advantage of elemental weaknesses. And in gameplay, I didn't describe this much in gameplay, but in gameplay, it's simply a debuff on the enemy that keeps stacking as you attack with the other element. And then the conquering attack will then deal extra damage and apply the new one. And that just sort of keeps looping over and over. Now, you can of course press the wrong one. You don't really get punished per se. You just lose a lot of damage, so... but it's not like, let's say, Black Mage, where if you fuck up, you you want to kill yourself. So it's not actually a very punishing job. It's actually a pretty simple job. Like, I know my explanation may make it sound very complicated, but trust me, it's like very simple. And who this job is intended for, or kind of who it appeals to. Well, as I said, first of all, it appeals to Star Wars fans. Then it appeals to people who like Mystic Knight, and of course fans of HEMA. The animations would basically replicate many of those old techniques, and that way emphasize the theme through the different forms. That's where the name Swordmaster comes from. In terms of aesthetics, I would probably have the AF gear rocking some sort of a badass medieval knight appearance, a bit like the Judge Magisters from 12 or something along those lines. In terms of gameplay, it appeals to people who kinda like when a job makes them think ahead, right? Because the basic flow of this job is, you can play this job really brain dead. You can always do the same order with the forms, right? But that may not always be the best for damage. So it basically, if you enjoy that, you have to think maybe 20 seconds, 40 seconds, maybe even a minute ahead. This appeals to you. It's in that sense, it's a bit like the old ninja, which is probably why I went for this tip. Now, for some additional things regarding background lore, the job itself is very recent. It's discovered by people venturing into Eureka, though, as I said, the sword techniques themselves are old Corvosi forms, utilizing the Magitech Saber. So they went into Eureka and discovered these special magicites and figured they would make you a fantastic addition to their existing swordplay. And elementally enhanced, they would be able to utilize those saber forms to their full potential. So this job is kind of, it's a little like Machinist, where it's a very, very recent, like, fledgling job. So you're kind of, you yourself are kind of developing this as you go, which again appeals to the whole like sword techniques theme. You're kind of making your own techniques as well as you go. As an example, I would have on final level, you would unlock a 7th form, a completely unique form outside of this regular mechanic, where you kind of just get to go super crazy. And I would return for this 7th form. I would return the old mechanic, if you guys remember. We used to have this mechanic where certain jobs had a button, a finisher, let's call it, that at below 20% health, they could use this ability. But the developers scrapped this because it made kind of balancing harder, because some jobs would kind of have their damage spike after the boss dropped below 20%. My fix for this would be that this last level skill that you can only use at below 20% health, I would give it a long as fuck cooldown. Like, even Hallowed Ground has nothing on this shit. And the idea is that you only get to use it once. So choose it well. But if you want to be really like anime about it, you can obviously just use it to finish the enemy off. So this form lasts like 20 seconds and you just deal insane damage. Like, you just go fucking ham. And in a sense, it has also kind of a Star Wars appeal, right? Because you could think of the regular mechanic as like you staying in harmony, as was with Lightside. And that also goes back to how the crystals used to, like in the series, they always represent harmony, right? But then this 7th form is kind of like, nah, fuck harmony, you just go crazy. Surrender to the dark side, basically. As I said, you don't need to do Eureka to unlock this job, because there's just a time bubble essentially, so we don't need to give a fuck. However, I would make it so that you have extra dialogue, and in fact, I would have like an optional quest at the very end that you can only do if you went into Eureka. and this quest would take place in Eureka. It's like this extra episode essentially. I just figured that would be really cool. This would give no rewards or nothing. It would just be for fun. For those who liked Eureka, you can kind of go back there for a bit. I don't know what elements of this job would realistically come to be represented. Because Mystic Knight, for example, some people say Paladin kind of takes the role of Mystic Knight right now. So we don't know if they would ever consider something like this. But in essence, I wanted this to be kind of like Astro, where, like you guys know that Astro, it's kind of a new job to FF14, but it still has mechanics from Time Mage and Gambler. So this is kind of the same. It's a very fresh idea, but it still takes some inspiration from Mystic Knight. So it's in that sense a balance of fresh, but also a callback.
The only thing that interests me is what would you think they would do for like weapon glamours for something of this type?
Yes.
Obviously, it's a hilt with a blade of light. Would the blade of light change with the weapon, or would it just be the hilt? Would it be different colors, or so on?
So yeah, I kind of thought about it because I assumed that some people would look at a lightsaber and be like, well, this is not a very feasible weapon, right? Because lightsabers, at least when you look at just the main Star Wars films, there aren't too many varieties, right? They're pretty basic. But if you actually look into the EU, though, there's a shit ton variations of the lightsaber, and you could make some very interesting. The background footage you see right now, this is actually a mod. So credits to whoever made it. I forgot who.
I think you mean incredibly good Photoshop, right? Sweat.
Oh yeah. There's nothing illegal going on here, Yoshi-P. But I would imagine. Instead of being just a straight up lightsaber, obviously they can't just implement a lightsaber. I would imagine it would look something like this, right? Where it's like this sword that, has like ether coming off of it. It looks a bit unstable, in a sense. But obviously it would kind of vary. I would have the basic ones, the ones you unlock at the start and some leveling ones. They would look really basic, obviously. But then as you move on to like the relics and shit, you have some cool potential. As for the coloring, probably honestly just making like normal dye. But this one would obviously be very interesting with the dye because, it would also dye the blade potentially. But that's an interesting question. I'm not sure how they would actually handle it. Also, technically, if they wanted to, they could make it like Reaper, where your appearance changes in that Form 7, just to really sell it.
What would you describe the limit break of your job, the one that you want in the game? How would it look like?
I didn't really think about it, to be honest. Like the problem is that all the melee limit breaks are kind of already like used in a way, like all the ideas. But I would probably have it be where you guys know the level 89 trial. I don't want to be too spoilery here, but level 89 trial, these 6 crystals appear around the arena. I would have that happen, and the crystals kind of combo, like with Thornton's ultimate end. They all like combine in the middle to like just do a shit ton of damage, and that way you would have the Mystic Knight element. So you summon 6 crystals, and they go like on an enemy, and that would be the idea.